January 1944. The North Atlantic Ocean. 125 pounds. That's what Lieutenant Matthias Keller weighed when American sailors pulled him from the freezing water 40 miles off the coast of South Carolina. His U-boat, the U-534, had been hunting Allied convoys for 11 months straight. 4 months ago, the food ran out. 3 weeks ago, the emergency rations ran out. 1 week ago, they started eating the leather from spare equipment belts boiled in seawater to make it soft enough to chew. Matthias Keller was 32 years old. He was a mechanical engineer from Hamburg who had graduated top of his class in 1933. He had a wife named Anneliese and 2 daughters, Elke and Liesel. Before the war, he weighed 178 pounds of solid German engineering precision. Now, when the American medics laid him on the deck of the destroyer USS Peterson, his ribs showed through his skin like fence posts. His teeth were loose in his gums. His hair came out in clumps when they tried to wash the diesel fuel off his scalp. 11 men survived when the U-534 went down. 3 had already died of starvation before the depth charges hit. They died in their bunks too weak to even cry out. The youngest was 19 years old and weighed 68 pounds when his heart finally stopped. They wrapped him in a canvas tarp because they had no German flag left to use as a burial shroud. The salt had rotted it away. Keller remembered every detail of those final months underwater. The taste of boot leather boiled until it turned into grey paste. The sound of men's stomachs making wet gurgling noises in the dark because there was nothing left to digest. The smell of unwashed bodies pressed together in a metal tube that measured 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, with 47 men breathing the same recycled air for weeks at a time. He remembered the last supply ship they sank. November 15th, 1942. The SS Portland, a British merchant vessel carrying grain from Canada to England. They hit it with 2 torpedoes at dawn. It went down in 4 minutes. There were 280 men aboard. The Portland didn't have enough lifeboats for everyone. Keller watched through the periscope as men jumped into the freezing Atlantic wearing nothing but their work clothes. Some of them screamed. Most of them just slipped under the surface without making a sound. He wrote in his logbook, SS Portland sunk. Estimated 280 crew. No survivors observed. Total kills, 12 ships, approximately 2,400 souls. Then he closed the logbook and ordered the U-534 to dive to 200 feet because British destroyers were coming and he had a crew to keep alive. That was 14 months ago. Now he was lying on an American ship listening to American voices speaking English all around him. The medic checking his pulse was maybe 20 years old with red hair and freckles. He kept saying the same thing over and over. Jesus Christ, how are you even alive? Keller didn't answer because he didn't know if he was allowed to speak. In the Nazi training, they taught that Americans would torture prisoners for information. They taught that Americans were savages who didn't follow the Geneva Convention. They taught that the United States was a weak, collapsing nation being held together by Jewish bankers and communist sympathizers, and that any day now the whole rotten structure would fall apart. The medic wrapped him in 3 wool blankets that smelled like soap and cigarette smoke. Someone else brought a metal cup filled with warm broth. Not soup, just broth. Thin and salty with tiny bits of potato floating in it. The medic held the cup to Keller's lips and tilted it slowly. Small sips, sir. Your stomach's the size of a fist right now. You try to drink too fast, you'll just throw it all back up. Keller took a sip. The salt hit his tongue first, then the warmth spread down his throat into his chest. His stomach clenched immediately. For a moment he thought he would vomit, but he forced himself to swallow. The medic was right. His stomach had shrunk. 4 months of near starvation had turned his digestive system into something small and frightened and suspicious of food. He took another sip, then another. The medic smiled. That's good, sir. That's real good. We're going to get some weight back on you. Keller closed his eyes. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, "If America is collapsing, why do they have wool blankets and potato broth to spare for enemy prisoners?" He pushed the thought away. The propaganda was clear. America was losing. Germany was winning. These supplies were just the last reserves of a dying nation used to create the illusion of strength. Any day now, the truth would be revealed. He believed this with absolute certainty. 7 months later, standing at Niagara Falls, that certainty would be shattered into a million pieces. But first, he had to survive long enough to get there. The USS Peterson brought the survivors to a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. They were transferred immediately to a military hospital where doctors examined them for 3 days straight. They measured, they weighed, they took blood samples and x-rays and asked questions in broken German about their medical histories. On the 4th day, a U.S. Army officer came to Keller's bed and told him he was being transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Alabama, a place called Camp Aliceville. The officer spoke perfect German with a slight Austrian accent. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the officer said. "You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will not be tortured or abused. You will be allowed to write letters home. Do you understand?" Keller nodded. "Good. The bus leaves tomorrow at 600. That night, lying in the hospital bed with clean sheets and a real pillow, Keller thought about his family in Hamburg. He hadn't received a letter from Annalisa in 8 months. The last one arrived in May of 1943, just before the U-534 began its final patrol. She wrote that the girls were healthy. Elke was doing well in school. Liesel had learned to ride a bicycle. The neighborhood was quiet. Everyone was doing their duty for the fatherland. She didn't mention food. She didn't mention bombing raids. She didn't mention anything that might be censored by the military authorities who read every letter before it was sent. But Keller could read between the lines. Everyone is doing their duty meant we are following orders and not complaining. The neighborhood is quiet meant there are no men left because they're all at war. The girls are healthy meant we are surviving. He wondered what they were eating. He wondered if the ration cards still provided enough. He wondered if Annalisa was telling him the truth or just writing what she thought he needed to hear. Then he fell asleep and dreamed of boot leather boiling in seawater. The next morning they loaded him onto a bus with 11 other German prisoners. All of them were U-boat survivors. All of them looked like walking skeletons dressed in oversized grey prison uniforms with large white circles painted on the back for easy identification. The bus drove south for 2 days, stopping at military checkpoints along the way. Keller sat near a window and watched America pass by outside. What he saw made no sense. According to Nazi propaganda, the American economy was supposed to be in ruins. Factories were supposed to be shut down. Cities were supposed to be bombed to rubble. The people were supposed to be starving and desperate and ready to surrender. But outside the window, Keller saw green fields stretching to the horizon. He saw dairy cows grazing in pastures fat and healthy. He saw farmers driving tractors through rows of corn that stood 8 feet tall. He saw red barns with fresh paint and white farmhouses with flowers in the gardens. In one small town in Georgia, the bus stopped at a traffic light. Keller looked out at the main street. There was a grocery store with its windows full of goods, a hardware store displaying tools and equipment, a restaurant with people sitting inside eating lunch. Civilian cars were parked along the street despite gasoline rationing. Everything looked normal, peaceful, prosperous. Keller felt a knot forming in his stomach. This was not possible. Germany had U-boats blockading the shipping lanes. German bombers had surely reached American cities by now. The North American industrial base was supposed to be collapsing. Where were the signs of suffering? Where were the destroyed buildings? Where were the desperate, starving people? The propaganda had been very clear on this point. America was weak. America was dying. America was held together only by lies and Jewish gold, and once the German military applied enough pressure, the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. But the farms outside the window looked strong. The towns looked intact. The people looked fed. One of the guards walked down the aisle checking on the prisoners. Keller caught his attention and asked in careful English, "Where are you taking us?" The guard was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair and a sunburned face. He smiled, but said nothing, just shook his head and kept walking. Keller turned back to the window. Doubt crept into his mind like cold water seeping through a crack. Maybe they were only showing him what they wanted him to see. Maybe this was a carefully staged route designed to make America look stronger than it really was. Maybe the real devastation was hidden somewhere else in the cities away from these carefully maintained rural roads. He wanted to believe that. He needed to believe that. Because if America wasn't collapsing, then everything he had been told was a lie. And if everything he had been told was a lie, then the 2,400 men he sent to the bottom of the Atlantic died for nothing. The bus arrived at Camp Aliceville on a hot afternoon in late January 1944. The camp sat on 75 acres of flat Alabama farmland surrounded by guard towers and double rows of barbed wire fence. Inside the fences were rows of wooden barracks painted white arranged in neat geometric patterns like a small military town. Keller and the other new arrivals were processed through the main gate. They were searched. They were photographed. They were assigned barracks numbers and bunk assignments. A camp officer explained the rules in German no-escape attempts: no violence, no destruction of property. Follow the Geneva Convention and they would be treated fairly. Then they were led to the mess hall for dinner. This was the moment that would plant the first seed of doubt deep in Matthias Keller's mind. This was the moment that would begin the destruction of everything he believed. This was the first bacon scene. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. It smelled like coffee and fried meat, and something sweet that Keller couldn't immediately identify. There were maybe 200 men already inside, all wearing the same grey prison uniforms, all eating from metal trays. An American cook, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a white apron, stood behind a serving counter. He looked at Keller and the other new arrivals and said something in English that Keller didn't understand. Then he started filling trays with food. Keller took his tray and sat down at an empty table. For a long moment he just stared at what was in front of him. 4 strips of bacon, thick-cut dark brown, glistening with fat. 2 fried eggs with bright yellow yolks that weren't quite fully cooked, so the centers were still soft and runny. 3 slices of white bread toasted, spread with real butter that was melting into the warm surface. A cup of milk, not powdered milk, not condensed milk. Fresh milk, white and opaque, with a faint smell of cream. Keller's hands started shaking. He hadn't seen bacon in 5 years. The last time he ate bacon was 1939, before the war started, at a Sunday breakfast with Annalisa and the girls. Back when Elke was 4 years old and Liesel was barely walking. Back when Hamburg was still a normal city where normal people ate normal food. He picked up a strip of bacon with his fingers. It was hot. The grease stuck to his skin. The edges were crispy and hard, but the middle was still soft and pliable. He could feel the fat content just from touching it. He brought it to his nose and inhaled. The smell hit him like a physical force. Salt and smoke and caramelization and pork fat rendering in a hot pan. It was the smell of abundance, the smell of peacetime, the smell of a world where people had enough food to cook meat for breakfast. He bit into it. The salt exploded on his tongue, first sharp and overwhelming. Then the fat melted across his palate, coating his mouth, sliding down his throat like warm silk. There was a subtle sweetness underneath from the pork itself, and a deep, smoky flavor from whatever wood they'd used to cure it. In that moment, there was no war. There was no ocean. There were no drowning men screaming in burning oil. There was no U-534 sinking in the dark. There was no Hamburg, or Annalisa, or Elke, or Liesel. There was only bacon. Keller ate all 4 strips in less than 2 minutes. Then he ate the eggs, breaking the yolks with his fork and letting the yellow centers run out onto the plate. He sopped up the yolk with the buttered toast. He drank the milk in 4 long swallows, feeling it cool his throat, tasting the faint sweetness of lactose. His stomach, which had shrunk to the size of a child's fist after 4 months of starvation, suddenly rebelled. He barely made it outside before he vomited everything onto the dirt behind the mess hall. He stood there for 5 minutes, bent over, hands on his knees, dry heaving until there was nothing left to bring up. Then, because the food was too precious to waste, because he couldn't stand the thought of losing it, he went back inside and forced himself to eat a piece of plain toast, slowly taking tiny bites, letting each one settle before taking the next. The cook watched him from behind the counter, but said nothing. That night, lying in his bunk in Barrack 7, Matthias Keller stared at the ceiling and thought about his mother in Hamburg. What was she eating tonight? Barley soup, probably. Maybe potato peels if she could find them. Maybe bread made from sawdust and flour substitute, because real wheat flour was reserved for the military, and he had just eaten 4 strips of bacon. Real bacon, American bacon, thick-cut pork bacon from pigs that had been fed corn and grain and whatever else American farmers fed their pigs. He had eaten it and then vomited it up and then eaten more, while his mother, his wife, his daughters went to bed hungry. The guilt was a small thing at first, just a whisper in the back of his mind, easy to ignore, easy to push away. But it was there, and over the next 7 months it would grow into something he could no longer ignore. The days at Camp Aliceville fell into a rhythm. Wake at 600, breakfast at 6:30, work details or educational classes from 800 to 1600, lunch at noon, dinner at 17:30, lights out at 2200. The food kept coming. 3 meals a day, every day, without fail. Breakfast was usually eggs and bacon or pancakes with syrup or oatmeal with brown sugar. Lunch was soup and sandwiches, sometimes with fruit. Dinner was meat and potatoes and vegetables. Real meat. Beef or pork or chicken cooked in pans with seasoning and served hot. Keller's body began to recover. In February he weighed 131 pounds. In March 142. In April 153. By May of 1944, 5 months after arriving at Camp Aliceville, he weighed 165 pounds. His hair grew back. His teeth stopped aching. The constant gnawing hunger that had lived in his gut for so long finally went away. He was eating 2,800 calories per day. The American military had calculated exactly how many calories a prisoner of war needed to maintain health according to the Geneva Convention, and they provided that amount without deviation. Outside the fence, American families were living on ration cards: 3 gallons of gasoline per week, 2 pounds of sugar per month, 28 ounces of meat per week. Coffee was rationed, butter was rationed, shoes were rationed. Everything was being funneled into the war effort. But inside Camp Aliceville, the German prisoners ate 3 full meals a day and complained if the portions were too small. Keller saw the guards sometimes sitting in the shade during their breaks, eating the same rations as the prisoners. They didn't seem to mind. They were mostly young men from Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee farm boys who'd been drafted and assigned to guard duty instead of combat. They treated the prisoners with distant politeness. No abuse, no torture. Just professional military courtesy. One of the guards stood out. His name was Private Dalton Wyatt. He was 22 years old, tall and thin, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of easy southern manner that made him seem younger than he was. He came from a small town in Georgia where his family raised chickens and grew tobacco. Wyatt was assigned to Barrack 7 where Keller lived. He made his rounds 3 times a day, checking to make sure no one was planning an escape or hoarding contraband or causing trouble. Mostly, he just walked through and nodded at people. In March, Keller asked him a question in English. "Why do you treat us like this?" Wyatt stopped and looked at him. "Like what, sir?" "Like human beings. We are your enemy." Wyatt thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "My mama always told me that hate is easy. Kindness takes work. I figure if I'm going to spend my time here, I might as well do the hard thing." Then he continued his rounds. Keller thought about that conversation for days afterward. It didn't fit with anything he'd been taught about Americans. They were supposed to be cruel, vindictive, eager to punish their enemies. But Wyatt just walked his rounds and called people sir and did his job. In April, Keller learned why Wyatt had been assigned to guard duty instead of combat. He had a younger brother named Danny. Danny Wyatt was 19 years old and had enlisted in the infantry in 1943. He went to Europe with the 1st Infantry Division and landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. He was killed 3 hours after the landing. shot through the chest by a German machine gunner while trying to cross an open field. Dalton Wyatt learned about it in a telegram that arrived at Camp Aliceville on June 15, 1944. Keller saw him that day sitting on the steps outside the guard barracks, holding the telegram in his hands, staring at nothing. The next day, Wyatt was back on his rounds. Same routine, same polite nods, same distant professionalism. He still called Keller Sir. Keller couldn't understand it. This man's brother had been killed by Germans, by men just like Keller. Men who followed the same orders, believed the same propaganda, served the same cause, and Wyatt still treated him with basic human dignity. It made no sense. Unless everything Keller had been taught about Americans was wrong. That thought was dangerous. Keller pushed it away. He focused on other things. He attended the re-education classes that the Americans offered, where they showed newsreels of the D-Day invasion and handed out newspapers reporting on Allied victories in France. He sat in those classes with 400 other German officers and watched them laugh at the footage. Hollywood propaganda, they said. Staged photos. Fake news designed to break German morale. When the Americans showed them a film of Paris being liberated in August of 1944 with crowds of French civilians cheering in the streets, the German officers shook their heads and smiled. Very convincing special effects, they said. But we know the truth. Germany is winning. The Allies are desperate. These films are their last attempt to avoid total collapse. Keller wanted to believe them. He needed to believe them. But the doubt kept growing. In July of 1944, a letter arrived from Hamburg. It had been sent in February and had taken 5 months to reach him through the military postal system and the Red Cross and the various layers of bureaucracy and censorship that controlled all communication between prisoners and their families. The letter was from Annalisa. Keller sat on his bunk and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the kind of cheap material you used when real paper was scarce. The handwriting was Annalisa's careful script, each letter perfectly formed, despite the poor quality pen she must have used. "My dearest Matthias," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. Standard opening. Safe. Approved by the censors. The girls ask about you every night. Elke is helping me with the household tasks. She is very responsible for her age. Liesel asks when you will come home. I tell her I do not know, but that you are doing your duty and we must be patient." Keller's eyes moved down the page. "We are managing with what remains. This winter we learned to make soup from the inner bark of trees. It is softer than you might expect when boiled long enough. Greta asked me if American prisoners get to eat bread. I told her I did not know." Keller stopped reading. He went back and read that paragraph again. "We learned to make soup from the inner bark of trees." Bark soup. His wife was feeding their daughters bark soup, not because it was a delicacy, not because it was a traditional recipe, but because there was nothing else. What remains? What remains after the ration cards stopped providing enough? What remains after the real food ran out? What remains when you are starving in the middle of an industrial city in the wealthiest nation in Europe? Greta asked me if American prisoners get to eat bread. Liesel, not Greta. Keller's mind corrected the error automatically. Annalisa meant Liesel. She must have been writing quickly, or maybe the cheap pen skipped, or maybe she was just tired and made a mistake. Or maybe she was sending a message in code. Maybe she was telling him that things were so bad that she could barely think straight. Maybe she was telling him that his daughters were starving and there was nothing she could do about it. He kept reading. "The neighbor's son returned from the Eastern Front last month. He cannot speak anymore. He sits in his mother's kitchen and stares at the wall. The doctors say there is nothing physically wrong with him. His body works, but something inside is broken. We pray for him every Sunday at church, though there are not many of us left who still attend. The priest is 70 years old. All the young priests went to the front." The letter continued for another page, describing small details of daily life in Hamburg. The weather, the garden where Annalisa was trying to grow potatoes in the small plot behind their apartment building. Elke's progress in school, though. School was only in session 3 days a week now because there weren't enough teachers. Then at the end, "I hope you are well, my love. Please come home when you can. We miss you. We need you. The girls are strong, but they are still so young. Elke is 11 now. Liesel is 8. They are growing up without their father. I do my best, but I am not enough alone. Please survive. Please come back to us. Your loving wife, Anneliese." Keller folded the letter carefully and put it in the small wooden box under his bunk where he kept his few personal possessions. Then he lay down and stared at the ceiling. That night, dinner was roast beef with mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, butter, and milk. Keller ate all of it. His plate was clean when he returned it to the kitchen window. He had consumed approximately 900 calories at that one meal. In Hamburg, his wife and daughters were eating bark soup. The guilt was no longer a whisper. It was a shout. It was a scream. It filled his head until he couldn't think about anything else. He had eaten 4 strips of bacon every morning for 6 months while his family starved. He had gained 40 pounds while his daughters learned what tree bark tasted like when boiled in water. He had survived while Anneliese did everything alone in a city that was being bombed and starved into submission. That night, Matthias Keller made a decision. He would accept whatever the Americans told him. He would attend the re-education classes. He would watch the films. He would read the newspapers. He would look for the truth, even if the truth was painful. Because if there was even a chance that Germany was losing even a small chance, then he needed to know. He needed to prepare himself. He needed to understand what he would be going home to. He fell asleep thinking about Anneliese's letter, and he dreamed of Liesel asking if American prisoners got to eat bread. In mid-August of 1944, strange rumors began circulating through Camp Aliceville. Guards were being assigned to special duty. 2 civilian buses had arrived from a transport company in a nearby town. The buses were old with rattling engines, but they had been inspected and approved for a long trip. Fuel allocations had been approved, which was unusual during strict wartime rationing. Something was being planned, but no one would say what. On the morning of August 15th, guards entered Barracks 7 and called out 30 names. Keller's name was on the list. "Line up outside in your regular uniforms at 600 tomorrow morning," the guard said. "No explanation, no questions, just be ready." That night, the men whose names had been called sat together in the barracks and speculated. Were they being transferred to another camp? Were they being sent home as part of a prisoner exchange? Were they being taken somewhere for punishment because someone had violated the rules? In a prison camp, any unexpected change could mean danger. The prisoners had no rights, no control, no way to protect themselves if the Americans decided to break the Geneva Convention rules. Keller lay in his bunk that night and thought about possibilities. The best case was a transfer to a camp closer to the coast, maybe preparing for repatriation. The worst case was execution. Some kind of secret program to eliminate enemy officers who knew too much about German U-boat tactics. He didn't think the worst case was likely. The Americans had been scrupulously correct in following the Geneva Convention. They fed the prisoners well. They allowed letters. They provided medical care. They hadn't shown any indication of brutality. But still, you never knew. Before he went to sleep, Keller wrote a letter to Anneliese. He kept it short and simple. He didn't mention the mysterious trip. He just wrote, "My dearest wife, if you receive this letter under strange circumstances, please know that I never stopped loving you and our daughters. I did my duty as I understood it at the time. I pray that you can forgive me for the years we lost. Please tell Elke and Liesel that their father thought of them every day. Your loving husband, Matthias." He sealed the letter and put it in the outgoing mail slot. Then he went to sleep. At exactly 600 on August 18th, 1944, 30 German prisoners stood in a single line outside the main gate of Camp Aliceville. Guards searched each man carefully, checking pockets and patting down uniforms. The prisoners wore their standard grey prison clothing with large white circles painted on the back for easy identification. Keller stood near the front of the line, his face showing no emotion. Whatever was about to happen, he would face it with the dignity expected of a German officer. 2 buses waited on the gravel road outside the fence. They were civilian vehicles painted a faded blue with worn seats and windows that rattled in their frames. The engines were running, making a rough chugging sound that suggested the buses had seen many years of hard use. 6 American guards climbed aboard, 3 in each bus, carrying rifles. The guards positioned themselves at the front, middle, and back of each vehicle. Only then were the prisoners ordered to board. Keller climbed the steps into the first bus and took a seat near a window. The other prisoners filed in quietly, filling the seats row by row. Nobody spoke. The bus doors closed with a metallic clang, and the vehicles rolled forward, leaving Camp Aliceville behind. Through the window, Keller could see other prisoners watching from the barracks. They looked worried. Keller felt worried too, though he would never show it. The buses turned south onto Highway 11, a paved road that stretched across southern Alabama. Keller pressed his face close to the window, determined to memorize everything he saw. If this was his last journey, he would at least know where they took him. But as the minutes passed, his confusion grew deeper instead of his fear. The countryside looked nothing like what he expected. According to Nazi propaganda, North America was supposed to be a bombed wasteland, a continent brought to its knees by years of war and economic collapse. German newspapers showed fake photographs of starving children in New York. German radio claimed Canadian cities were rubbed to rubble. German newsreels showed staged scenes of Allied defeats and industrial breakdown. But outside his window, Keller saw green fields stretching to the horizon. Dairy cows grazed peacefully in pastures fat and sleek in the August heat. Farmers drove tractors through golden wheat fields, bringing in the summer harvest. Red barns stood fresh painted beside white farmhouses with flower gardens in the yards. Children played in the dirt driveways, chasing each other and laughing. The buses passed through small towns in Tennessee and Kentucky. Keller saw church steeples rising above tree lines, county courthouses with American flags, pharmacies advertising Coca-Cola in their windows, feed stores where farmers loaded supplies into pickup trucks, children riding bicycles down tree-lined streets. Everything looked normal, peaceful, prosperous. Everything looked normal, peaceful, prosperous. Keller felt the knot in his stomach tighten. This was not possible. Germany had U-boats blockading the shipping lanes. German bombers were supposed to be hitting American industrial centers. The North American economy was supposed to be on the verge of total collapse. Where were the signs of suffering? Where were the destroyed buildings? Where were the desperate, starving people? One of the guards walked down the aisle, checking on the prisoners. Keller caught his attention. "Where are you taking us?" he asked in English. The guard smiled but said nothing. He just shook his head and kept walking. The buses continued south, eating up the miles on smooth pavement. Keller noticed the roads themselves were in excellent condition. In Germany, even before the war started, roads in rural areas often had potholes and rough patches. These American roads seemed freshly maintained. More evidence that didn't fit the story he'd been told. Another prisoner, a former Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Neumann, who sat across the aisle, leaned over and whispered in German, "Have you seen any bomb damage?" Keller shook his head. "No, nothing. Maybe we're not near any cities yet. Maybe they're hiding the damage from us." Keller wanted to believe that, but doubt was creeping into his mind like cold water seeping through a crack in a ship's hull. The buses passed more farms, more towns, more signs of normal life continuing during wartime. He saw a truck loaded with industrial equipment heading north. He saw a train in the distance pulling freight cars full of cargo. He saw a billboard advertising war bonds showing a smiling American soldier with the words, "Buy bonds for victory," in big red letters. Neumann pointed at the billboard. "Propaganda," he said quietly, but his voice sounded uncertain. The buses drove for 6 hours, stopping once for the guards to use a restroom at a gas station. The prisoners were allowed to get off and stretch their legs, but they stayed in formation, surrounded by guards. At noon, the buses pulled into a small roadside diner in Tennessee, just across the state line from Alabama. The sign above the door said, "May's Country Kitchen," in hand-painted letters. One of the guards, a corporal with sergeant stripes, spoke to the prisoners in broken German. "Lunch stop. 30 minutes. We buy food for you. You sit, you eat. You no make trouble. Understand?" The prisoners nodded. They filed into the diner and sat at 2 long tables near the back. The other customers, mostly truck drivers and local farmers, stared at them. The white circles on their backs made it obvious they were prisoners. But nobody said anything. Nobody made threats. They just stared and went back to their meals. The corporal went to the counter and spoke with the woman working there, presumably May herself. She was in her 50s, heavy-set, with grey hair pulled back in a bun. She looked at the prisoners, looked at the guards, then nodded and went into the kitchen. 15 minutes later, she came back with trays of food. This was the second bacon scene. This was the moment when Matthias Keller began to understand that everything he believed might be wrong. May set the tray down in front of him. On it was a sandwich, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a slice of pie. The sandwich was a BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato on toasted white bread with mayonnaise. Keller stared at it. 3 strips of bacon, thick-cut, perfectly crispy on the edges, but still soft in the middle. Bright green lettuce, fresh and cold. 2 thick slices of red tomato, so ripe that juice was already seeping into the bread. The mayonnaise was spread thick, white and creamy, holding everything together. He picked it up with both hands. It was heavy, substantial. The kind of sandwich that would fill a working man's stomach and keep him satisfied for hours. He bit into it. The flavors hit him in layers. First, the salt from the bacon, sharp and immediate. Then the acid from the tomato, bright and clean. Then the fat from the mayonnaise, smooth and rich. Then the crunch of the lettuce and the crispy toast providing texture. Then underneath everything, the sweetness of the tomato and the smoky depth of the bacon. It was a symphony. Every ingredient balanced perfectly. Every bite exactly the same as the last. This wasn't survival food. This wasn't prison rations. This was what people ate when they had enough. Keller set the sandwich down and reached for the Coca-Cola. The bottle was made of thick glass, ice cold, with condensation beading on the outside. He'd seen Coca-Cola before the war in Hamburg, sold in expensive restaurants as an American luxury item. He'd never tasted it. He twisted off the cap. The carbonation hissed. He tilted the bottle and took a long drink. The sensation was like nothing he'd experienced. The bubbles attacked his tongue, sharp and aggressive. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful. The cold liquid burned down his throat. It tasted like sugar and caramel and something chemical he couldn't identify. It tasted like everything Germany said was dying in America. It tasted like abundance. He set the bottle down and looked at the pie. Apple pie, May had said when she brought it. A wedge the size of his fist with a golden brown crust that flaked when he touched it with his fork. The filling was dark and glistening, studded with chunks of cooked apple. On top was a scoop of vanilla ice cream, already melting into white pools around the edges. Keller took a bite. The crust dissolved on his tongue, butter and flour and salt in perfect proportion. The apple filling was sweet and tart at the same time, with cinnamon and nutmeg and a hint of lemon. The ice cream was cold and smooth and tasted like pure cream and sugar. He ate slowly, trying to memorize every sensation. The texture, the temperature, the way the flavors changed as they mixed together in his mouth. He thought about his mother in Hamburg. She was 64 years old. Before the war, she made Apfelkuchen every Sunday using apples from the tree in her small garden. Real German apple cake, not as sweet as American pie, but perfect with coffee on a Sunday afternoon. She hadn't made Apfelkuchen in 4 years. There was no sugar, no butter. The apple tree had been cut down for firewood during the winter of 1942, when coal became impossible to get. She was eating bark soup now, or maybe potato peels, or maybe nothing at all. And Keller was sitting in a Tennessee diner eating apple pie with ice cream, while an American guard bought it for him with American money. Private Dalton Wyatt sat down at the table next to Keller. He had ordered the same meal, a BLT, a Coke, and a slice of pie. He ate without speaking, just like Keller, working through the sandwich in steady bites. After a few minutes, Wyatt said, "My mama makes pie better than this. Uses Granny Smith apples from our orchard back home. When the war's over, when you fellows get to go home, Maybe you'll remember that Americans make pretty good pie. Keller looked at him. Your brother, Danny. He died in France, June 6th. Wyatt stopped chewing. His jaw tightened. Yes, sir. Omaha Beach. Killed by Germans, by men like me. Yes, sir. And you buy me lunch? Wyatt set his sandwich down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Danny knew what he signed up for. He knew the risks. He did his duty same as you did yours. War is hell for everybody, sir. Hating you won't bring him back, won't make anything better. My mama always said hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I figure she's right about that. He picked up his sandwich and took another bite. Keller felt something break inside his chest. Not the wall around his beliefs, not yet, but a crack. A small fracture that let light through. This man's brother was dead because of the German military, because of U-boats like the U-534 sinking supply ships, because of the war machine that Keller had been part of. And Wyatt was sitting here eating lunch with him, calling him sir, treating him like a human being instead of a monster. The propaganda said Americans were cruel, vindictive, that they would torture and abuse their prisoners. But here was Dalton Wyatt, 22 years old, buying sandwiches for the men whose country killed his brother. Keller's stomach felt heavy. Not from the food, though he'd eaten more in the past hour than his shrunken stomach wanted. Heavy from guilt. From the weight of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he'd been lied to about more than just America's economic situation. He finished the pie in silence. Then he followed the other prisoners back onto the bus. The buses drove north and east for the rest of the day. Alabama gave way to Tennessee, then Tennessee gave way to Kentucky. The sun moved across the sky and began to sink toward the horizon. Keller watched the landscape change outside the window, still looking for signs of the collapse he'd been promised. He saw none. Just more farms, more small towns, more evidence of a nation that was strained by war but not broken, not even close to broken. By evening, they were in southern New York State, heading northeast. The buses followed signs that said, Niagara Falls, 60 miles. Keller had heard of Niagara Falls before the war. Every educated German had. It was supposed to be one of the natural wonders of the world, a massive waterfall on the border between the United States and Canada. Over 160 feet tall, nearly half a mile wide, millions of gallons of water per minute. But in 1941, German newspapers published a series of articles claiming that Niagara Falls had been destroyed by industrial pollution. The articles said that factories upstream had dumped so much chemical waste into the Niagara River that the water was now toxic. The falls themselves had been reduced to a brown trickle, barely flowing, choked with industrial sludge. The articles included photographs, or what appeared to be photographs. Dark, muddy water, dead fish, smokestacks in the background. Keller had believed those articles. Why would the German government lie about a waterfall? What strategic purpose would that serve? Now, as the buses drove closer, he began to hear something strange. A deep, continuous rumbling, like thunder but constant, never stopping, never fading. The sky was clear, no storm clouds, no lightning. Just clear evening sky with the sun getting low on the horizon. The sound grew louder. Keller could feel it now even through the walls of the bus. A vibration, a pressure in his chest, a rumble so deep and so powerful that it made his ears ring. Neumann, the Luftwaffe pilot, leaned across the aisle again. What is that sound? Keller shook his head. I don't know. But he did know. Deep in his engineer's brain he knew exactly what that sound was. It was water, enormous amounts of water moving with tremendous force. The buses slowed and turned into a parking area. A sign said, Prospect Point, American side. There were a few civilian cars parked there despite gasoline rationing. Families out for an evening visit. The guards ordered the prisoners to exit the vehicles in single file. Keller stepped down from the bus and squinted in the fading sunlight. The sound was overwhelming now, a constant roar that made conversation impossible. It vibrated in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth. The air smelled different, clean, fresh. Like rain, but not rain. Like water, but more than water. There was mist in the air, tiny droplets settling on his face, his hands, his prison uniform, cold and clean and utterly pure. Guards formed two lines, one on each side of the prisoners, and began walking them toward a viewing area. Keller walked forward with the others, following a paved path that curved to the right. With each step, the roar grew louder. With each step, the mist grew thicker. With each step, the rumbling in his chest grew stronger. And then suddenly they rounded the corner. Matthias Keller stopped walking. His legs simply stopped obeying his brain. He stood frozen on the path, staring. The Horseshoe Falls stretched before him in a massive curved wall of white water, 2,600 feet wide, 167 feet tall, 750,000 gallons per second. The water came over the edge in a solid curtain, falling in an endless cascade that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It crashed into the churning pool below with such force that massive clouds of mist rose up like smoke hundreds of feet into the air. A perfect rainbow arced through the spray, its colors brilliant against the white foam. Red and orange and yellow and green and blue and violet hanging in the air like a promise. The sound drowned out everything. All thought, all speech, all possibility of pretending this was anything but real. Keller's legs carried him forward without permission from his brain. His boots crunched on the gravel path. The roar grew so loud it hurt his ears. The mist soaked through his uniform in seconds, making the fabric cling to his skin. He walked to the metal railing at the edge of the viewing platform and gripped it with both hands. The water was 50 feet in front of him, falling, always falling, never stopping. This could not be real. It was impossible. The volume was too great. The power was too immense. No natural force could sustain this. There had to be machinery. There had to be pumps hidden somewhere, massive industrial pumps creating this effect. Keller turned to look for them. His engineer's mind took over, analyzing, calculating, searching for evidence. Where were the pump houses? Where were the intake pipes? Where were the exhaust vents for the engines? He scanned the cliff face, limestone and shale layered in horizontal bands carved by millennia of erosion. No seams, no joints, no evidence of construction. He looked at the river upstream. The Niagara River flowed smooth and green a quarter-mile wide, moving fast toward the edge. No pipes, no visible infrastructure. He looked downstream at the base of the falls. The water crashed into the pool with such violence that waves rolled outward for hundreds of yards. The force was incredible, unrelenting. No pump system could create that force. Not continuously, not without visible machinery. Keller's hands tightened on the railing. His mind started doing the mathematics automatically, the way an engineer's mind always does when confronted with a problem. 750,000 gallons per second. Convert to metric 2,839,059 liters per second. Water weighs 1 kilogram per liter, so that's 2,839,059 kilograms per second, falling 167 feet. The force required to pump that volume would be, he calculated in his head, roughly 150,000 horsepower. Continuous output. No brakes. No downtime. An engine producing 150,000 horsepower would be the size of a 5-story building. It would consume approximately 600 gallons of diesel fuel per minute. That's 36,000 gallons per hour, 864,000 gallons per day. The United States was rationing gasoline at 3 gallons per week for civilian use. Where would they get 864,000 gallons of diesel per day to run a fake waterfall? Where would they hide an engine the size of a building? And even if they could hide it, why would they waste precious wartime resources on such an elaborate deception? The mathematics didn't work, the engineering didn't work, the logic didn't work, which meant... Keller's breath caught in his throat. Which meant this was real. The falls were real, the water was real, the power was real. Germany had told him this was destroyed. Germany had shown him photographs of pollution and toxic waste and industrial death. Germany had lied. If they lied about this, what else had they lied about? Keller stood at the railing for 45 minutes, watching the water fall. Other prisoners walked past him, some of them arguing in German about where the machinery was hidden, some of them standing in silence like he was. Franz Neumann appeared at his elbow. "Karl," he said, using Keller's false first name, the one that appeared on his forged papers. Then he corrected himself. "Matthias. I can't find the machines. I can't find the painted backdrops. I can't find anything that makes this fake." Keller didn't respond. Neumann's voice dropped to a whisper. "What if it's real?" "Shut up," Keller said. "Don't let them break you." But he didn't believe his own words. The crack in his certainty widened into a canyon, widened into an abyss. He looked down at his hands gripping the railing. They were shaking. If this was real, then his government had lied to him. Not about military tactics or strategy, those were expected, that was part of war. But they had lied about objective reality, about whether a waterfall existed, about whether America had food and resources, about whether the enemy was strong or weak. They had lied about everything. And if they had lied about everything, then the 2,400 men Matthias Keller had sent to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean had died for lies. He stood there for another 30 minutes watching the water fall, watching it fall without stopping, watching it fall with a power that no human engineering could possibly fake. Private Dalton Wyatt appeared beside him. Wyatt didn't say anything. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the falls. After a long silence, Keller whispered in German, "Mein Gott, es ist echt." My God, it's real. Wyatt didn't speak German, but he must have understood the tone. He reached out and put his hand on Keller's shoulder, not gripping, not restraining, just there. A gesture of simple human kindness from a man whose brother had died fighting Germans. Keller felt tears on his face. The first tears he'd cried since the war began. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding, of realization, of a man who had just discovered that he'd been living in a cage built from lies and the cage door had just swung open. The water kept falling, 750,000 gallons per second. Real, undeniable, too powerful to be faked. Truth had weight, and Matthias Keller could feel that weight crushing the lies he'd carried for 5 years. The buses were silent on the drive back to Camp Aliceville. 30 German officers sat in their seats and stared out the windows at the darkness. Some of them slept. Some of them pretended to sleep. Most of them just sat with their thoughts trying to process what they had seen. Keller didn't sleep. He sat near the window and watched the dark countryside pass by, thinking about mathematics and engineering and the lies that had shaped his entire adult life. They arrived back at camp just after midnight on August 20th. The prisoners filed off the buses and walked to their barracks in formation. Guards counted them at the gate. All 30 accounted for. No escape attempts, no incidents. Keller went to his bunk and lay down fully clothed. He didn't bother undressing. He just stared at the ceiling in the dark. At 6:30 the next morning, the camp loudspeakers crackled to life with an emergency announcement. "All prisoners report to the main yard immediately. This is not a drill." Keller dressed and joined the flow of men moving toward the central assembly area. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the guards moved, quick and tense. The camp commander, Colonel Horace Griggs, stood on a wooden platform in front of the assembled prisoners. He was 45 years old, a career officer with grey hair and the kind of face that never smiled. He held a piece of paper in his hand. He spoke in German slowly and clearly so everyone could understand. "Last night, one of your fellow officers took his own life. Major Werner Adler was found hanged in Barracks 12 at approximately 0400 hours. He left a note. I will read it now." Griggs unfolded the paper. "I cannot live in a world where everything I believed was a lie. I sent men to die for a cause built on deception. I commanded troops with honor and discipline, and I believed we were fighting for Germany's survival. But yesterday I stood at Niagara Falls and understood that we were never fighting for survival. We were fighting for lies. I have no honor left. I have nothing left. Forgive me. Griggs folded the paper and looked out at the silent crowd. Major Adler will be buried in accordance with military tradition. Any prisoner who wishes to attend the service may do so. That is all. The prisoners were dismissed. They walked back to their barracks in groups, speaking in low voices. Keller knew Werner Adler. Everyone knew him. He was 38 years old, a Wehrmacht officer who had fought in Poland and France and Russia. He was the most vocal Nazi loyalist in the entire camp, the man who led the groups that shouted down anyone who questioned the propaganda. The true believer. And now he was dead. Killed by the truth. That afternoon, Keller attended the burial. They put Adler in a simple wooden coffin and buried him in a corner of the camp cemetery under a marker that would eventually be replaced with a proper stone. A Protestant chaplain said prayers in German. 6 prisoners served as pallbearers. As they lowered the coffin into the ground, Keller thought, I could have been him. I was almost him. The only difference was that Keller had Anneliese and Elke and Liesel waiting for him in Hamburg. He had a reason to survive. He had something beyond the ideology. Adler had nothing but his beliefs, and when those beliefs shattered, there was nothing left to hold him together. Over the next 3 months, Camp Aliceville organized 11 more trips to Niagara Falls. They took different groups each time, 25 to 30 prisoners per trip. By the end of October 1944, 287 German officers had stood at that railing and experienced the same shock that Keller felt. The results were measurable. Before the trips began, the re-education program had a 0% success rate. Not a single prisoner accepted Allied information as truthful. After visiting Niagara Falls, 189 prisoners out of 287 began questioning what they had been told. That was a 66% success rate. These men started reading the Allied newspapers with genuine curiosity instead of contempt. They asked guards real questions about the war instead of making dismissive statements. They stopped automatically rejecting every piece of information from American sources. The wall of disbelief had cracked wide open. Keller became one of the leaders of what the other prisoners called the awakened group. He spent his evenings in the camp library reading every newspaper and magazine the Americans provided. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Stars and Stripes, Time magazine. He read about D-Day, June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, 156,000 Allied troops landing on 5 beaches in Normandy, American, British, Canadian forces establishing a foothold in France. He read about the liberation of Paris, August 25, 1944, Free French forces entering the city, crowds of civilians celebrating in the streets. The German occupation ended after 4 years. He read about the Soviet advance in the east, the Red Army pushing through Poland, German divisions being encircled and destroyed, the Eastern Front collapsing. Every article included details, names, dates, photographs, battle maps showing front lines moving steadily toward Germany from both directions. It was all consistent, all verifiable, all pointing to the same conclusion. Germany was losing. Badly. In October of 1944, Keller wrote a letter to Anneliese. It took him 3 days to compose because he had to be careful about what the censors would allow through. My dearest wife, he wrote, I hope this letter finds you and the girls in good health. I am well. The Americans treat us fairly according to the international agreements. I have seen things recently that have opened my eyes to truths I did not understand before. I cannot explain everything in a letter, but I want you to know that the situation is more complex than we were led to believe. Please prepare yourself and our daughters for difficult times ahead. The war may not end the way we were told it would. When I come home, we will need to be strong together. I think of you every day. I think of Elke learning to be responsible and helpful. I think of Liesel asking her questions about the world. I miss them both terribly. I miss you more than I can express in words. Whatever happens, know that I love you. Stay strong, Keep the girls safe. I will come home to you as soon as I am able. Your loving husband, Matthias. He mailed the letter and waited. The response came in early February of 1945. 4 months to cross the ocean and pass through all the bureaucratic channels. Annaliese's handwriting looked shakier than before, as if she had written the letter while very tired or very cold. My dearest Matthias, she wrote, your last letter gave me more hope than you can know. We are surviving, though winter is the hardest yet. Elke helps me forage for anything edible. She is very clever at finding things. Liesel still asks about you every night before sleep. I tell her stories about you so she will remember your face when you come home. The city is much changed since you left. I cannot write details, but you would not recognize many streets. We have adapted. We endure. Your letter spoke of truths and difficult times. I want you to know that I already understand. I have understood for a long time, but there was no safe way to tell you. Now perhaps we can speak plainly when you return. Come back to us, my love. We need you. The girls need their father. I need my husband. We will rebuild whatever must be rebuilt. Together. Your Anneliese. Keller read the letter 5 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box under his bunk with the previous letters. I have understood for a long time. Anneliese knew. She had known for months, maybe years, that the propaganda was lies, but she couldn't say it, couldn't write it, couldn't even hint at it until Keller himself had started to question. His wife was braver than he was. She had lived with the truth while he had been safe in his delusions. May 7th, 1945. The loudspeakers at Camp Aliceville crackled to life at 0800 hours. Colonel Griggs's voice came through, speaking slowly in German so everyone would understand. Attention all prisoners. I have an announcement from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Yesterday, May 7th, 1945, at 0241 hours, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The surrender was signed at Reims, France. The war in Europe is over. Adolf Hitler is dead. The Nazi government has collapsed. I repeat, Germany has surrendered. The war is over. Silence. Complete silence across the entire camp. 537 German officers stood frozen wherever they were, in the barracks, in the mess hall, in the yard, in the workshops. Then the sound started. Some men wept openly, tears streaming down their faces. Some sat down on the ground and stared at nothing. Some went to their bunks and lay down facing the wall. Some stood perfectly still with their fists clenched, refusing to accept it. A few still insisted it was Allied propaganda. One more lie in a long list of lies. But most of them knew the truth. It was over. Everything they had fought for was gone. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Over the next 3 days, 17 prisoners attempted suicide. Guards stopped 12 of them in time. 5 succeeded. Keller did not attempt suicide. He sat on his bunk and thought about Anneliese and Elke and Liesel. He thought about the 2,400 men he had killed. British sailors, Canadian sailors, Norwegian sailors, American sailors, men who died screaming in burning oil or drowned in the freezing Atlantic or were crushed when their ships broke apart. He had killed them for a government that lied, for a cause built on deception, for a war that Germany lost anyway. The guilt was overwhelming, a weight pressing down on his chest so hard he could barely breathe. But he did not choose death like Werner Adler had chosen death. He chose to live, for Anneliese, for Elke, for Liesel. He chose to live so he could go home and rebuild, so he could teach his daughters the lesson he had learned too late. Question everything. Trust what you can see and touch and verify for yourself. Never believe anyone who tells you that your enemies are less than human. In August of 1945, the first groups of German prisoners began the journey home. They were loaded onto transport ships and sent back across the Atlantic to whatever remained of their country. Keller's group left on August 23rd. The ship approached Hamburg on September 2nd, 1945. Keller stood on the deck and watched his homeland come into view. What he saw made him grateful that Niagara Falls had already destroyed his illusions. Hamburg was gone. Not literally gone, the city still existed. But 50% of it had been bombed into rubble. Entire neighborhoods were nothing but broken concrete and twisted metal. The port facilities were half destroyed. Cranes stood bent and useless against the sky. The smell hit him as soon as the ship docked. Smoke and dust and something else. Something organic and wrong. Death. Bodies were still being pulled from collapsed buildings 9 months after the war ended. Keller walked down the gangway onto German soil for the first time in 3 years. There was no electricity in most areas, no running water in many districts. People lived in basements and makeshift shelters made from pieces of bombed buildings. Children with thin faces and hollow eyes stood on street corners begging for food. Keller had been prepared for this. The men who had visited Niagara Falls had spent months learning to accept difficult truths. The waterfall had cracked open their certainty, and once that crack appeared, other truths could flow in. He felt deep sadness looking at his destroyed city, but he was not surprised. He made his way through the rubble-strewn streets to the neighborhood where he had lived before the war. The building was still standing, though several windows were blown out and there were shrapnel scars on the brick walls. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door. Annalisa opened it. She looked like a different person. She was 33 years old but appeared 48. Her hair had gone grey at the temples. Her face was gaunt, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. She weighed maybe 118 pounds when she should have weighed 135. But her eyes were the same brown eyes he had fallen in love with 14 years ago. She stared at him for 5 seconds. Then she said his name just once, Matthias. Then she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Behind her, 2 girls appeared in the doorway. Elke was 11 years old now, tall and thin with her mother's dark hair. She weighed 68 pounds. A healthy 11-year-old girl should weigh about 85 pounds. Liesel was 8 small for her age, with blonde hair like Keller's. She weighed 54 pounds when she should have weighed 65. Both girls stared at him like they were seeing a ghost. "Elke," he said. "Liesel, I'm home." Liesel started crying. Elke didn't cry. She just walked forward and wrapped her arms around his waist and held on. They went inside. The apartment had survived mostly intact, though there were cracks in the walls from bomb concussions, and the windows facing south had been replaced with boards because there was no glass available. That night, Annalisa cooked dinner for the family. This was the 3rd bacon scene. The devastating one. The one that brought all the guilt crashing down. Annalisa had saved rations for a week to make this meal. She had used every connection, every favor, every bit of influence she had to get the ingredients. She put 4 bowls on the table. In each bowl was a thin soup made from turnips and 1 small potato. The turnips were partially rotten brown spots cut away. The potato had been divided into 6 thin slices, distributed evenly among the 4 bowls. The soup had no salt. Salt had run out a year ago. There was no butter, no cream, no meat, no herbs. Just boiled turnips and potato in water. This was dinner for a family of 4. Keller looked at his bowl. Then he looked at Annalisa's face. Then at Elke's. Then at Liesel's. He thought about Camp Aliceville, about the breakfast he had eaten 1 week before they released him. 4 strips of bacon, 3 eggs, pancakes with syrup, coffee with real cream, orange juice, toast with butter and strawberry jam. That was 1 breakfast, 1 meal, for 1 prisoner, 1 enemy soldier. He had consumed approximately 900 calories at that breakfast alone. The soup in front of him now contained maybe 150 calories, and this was dinner for 4 people. His throat closed up. He couldn't swallow. Annalisa saw his face. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Matthias," she said quietly, "I'm glad they fed you. I'm glad you're alive. We will rebuild." "I ate bacon every morning for 6 months," he whispered. 4 strips, every single morning, while you were— I know. The girls were eating bark soup, and I know, Matthias, I know. Elke looked up from her bowl. Her voice was small and careful. Papa, you ate bacon, real bacon, while we were hungry. Keller couldn't answer. His voice wouldn't work. Elke's face showed no anger, just confusion, just a child trying to understand something that made no sense. Did you kill people, Papa? Mama said you were in the Navy. She said you fought in a submarine. Did you kill people for lies? Keller forced himself to meet his daughter's eyes. Yes, he said. I killed approximately 2,400 people. British sailors, Canadian sailors, others. I believed I was protecting Germany. I believed I was doing my duty. I was wrong. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. Elke nodded slowly, like she was filing this information away to think about later. Liesel didn't understand. She was only 8. She just knew her father was home, and that was enough for now. They ate the soup in silence. Keller forced himself to swallow every spoonful. It tasted like nothing, like water, with the faint suggestion of vegetable. But it was what his family had, so he ate it. That night, lying in bed next to Annalisa for the first time in 3 years, Keller did the mathematics one more time. He had gained 47 pounds in American captivity. Elke had lost 17 pounds from malnutrition. Liesel had lost 11 pounds, 47 pounds gained while his daughters lost 28 pounds combined. The numbers haunted him. Every pound he had gained in Camp Aliceville was a pound his family didn't have. Every strip of bacon was a day his daughters went hungry. Every comfortable night in a warm barracks was a night Annalisa shivered in a cold apartment with broken windows. He had survived. He had eaten well. He had been treated fairly. And his family had starved. The guilt would never leave him. He understood that now. It would be part of him forever, like a scar that never fully healed. But he would live with it. Because Annalisa needed him. Because Elke and Liesel needed their father. Because someone had to stay alive to tell the truth about what happened when good men believed lies. The years passed slowly in Hamburg. 1946. Keller found work as an engineer with a reconstruction company. The pay was minimal but steady. They were rebuilding the port facilities, trying to restore Hamburg's industrial capacity. 1947. Annalise opened a small sewing and alteration shop in the ground floor of their building. Women needed their old clothes repaired and resized as their bodies recovered from starvation. 1948. The Berlin airlift, the Cold War beginning, Germany divided, Hamburg in the British occupation zone. 1949. The Deutsche Mark introduced, currency stabilization, the economy beginning to recover. 1950. Elke graduated from school at 16 and began working as a secretary. Liesel, now 13, was excelling in her studies despite the stunted growth from malnutrition years. She would never be as tall as she should have been. The damage was permanent. In 1952, Keller made a decision. He sat at the kitchen table with Annalisa and told her, "I want to go back to America." She looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because they showed me kindness when they didn't have to. Because Private Dalton Wyatt lost his brother to men like me and he still bought me lunch. Because that country taught me the difference between lies and truth. Because I want our daughters to grow up somewhere that values truth. You want to leave Germany. I want to give us a choice. We can stay if you want, but I want to try. Annalisa was quiet. Then she said, "Submit the application. We'll see what happens." Keller applied for an immigration visa to the United States. The application was denied. Former enemy combatant. U-boat commander. Too much risk. In January 1953, he applied again. This time he included a letter explaining his experience at Camp Aliceville, the re-education program, the trip to Niagara Falls, his transformation from believer to skeptic. He included a reference letter from Colonel Griggs, who had retired from the army and was now teaching at a university in Alabama. In March of 1953, the visa was approved. On July the 12th, 1953, the Keller family boarded a ship in Hamburg Harbor. Matthias was 41 years old. Anneliese was 41. Elke was 19. Liesel was 16. They arrived in New York City 8 days later. Keller stood on the deck as the ship entered the harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger against the sky. He thought about the last time he saw New York Harbor in January of 1944, weighing 125 pounds, pulled from the freezing Atlantic after his submarine was destroyed. 9 years ago. A lifetime ago. They settled in Queens in a neighborhood full of German and Polish immigrants. Keller used his savings to rent a small storefront and opened a bookshop, German books and English books side by side. Literature and history and technical manuals for the immigrant engineers who were helping rebuild America's post-war infrastructure. The shop barely broke even for the first 2 years. But it survived. In 1957, Matthias Keller became a United States citizen. He stood in a courthouse in Manhattan and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The irony was not lost on him. In 1958, Elke married an American man, a mechanic from Brooklyn named Robert Morrison, an Irish-American with red hair and a gentle manner. They had a daughter in 1959. They named her Evelyn. Liesel went to college, pre-med. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to help people the way the American medics had helped her father in 1944. In 1961, Keller received a letter. The return address said, Dalton Wyatt, Valdosta, Georgia. He opened it with shaking hands. Dear Mr. Keller, it began. I hope this letter finds you well. The Red Cross helped me locate you. I wanted to reach out because I've thought about you often over the years. I remember the day we took you fellows to Niagara Falls. I remember standing next to you at the railing when you started crying. I didn't understand German, but I understood what you were feeling. I hope you made it home safely. I hope your family survived the war. I'd like to hear from you if you're willing to write back. Your friend, Dalton. Keller wrote back immediately. Thus began a correspondence that would last 33 years. They wrote to each other twice a year, exchanging updates about their families, their work, their thoughts about the war and what it meant. Dalton never blamed Keller for his brother's death. Keller never stopped feeling guilty about it. But they built a friendship anyway, built on the foundation of that moment at Niagara Falls when truth overpowered lies. The decades passed. 1960s. Evelyn growing up, the bookshop stable and profitable. Keller teaching his granddaughter to read in both German and English. 1970s. Liesel graduated medical school, became a pediatrician, married, had children of her own. 1980s. Keller's hair went white. His hands developed tremors. He sold the bookshop and retired at 69. In June of 1987, Evelyn came to visit her grandfather. She was 28 years old now, a lawyer working in Manhattan. She came to help him sort through old papers and belongings because he was downsizing to a smaller apartment. In the back of a closet, she found a wooden box. Inside the box was a logbook, a U-boat logbook, written in German in neat engineer's handwriting. She opened it to a random page. November 15th, 1942, 0647 hours. SS Portland sunk. 2 torpedoes, both hits. Vessel went down in 4 minutes. Estimated 280 crew aboard. No survivors observed in the water. Current conditions, heavy seas, visibility poor. U-534 diving to 200 feet. British destroyers approaching from northwest. Total kills to date, 12 ships, approximately 2,400 souls. Evelyn sat down on the floor of the closet holding the logbook. Her grandfather had killed 2,400 people. She found him in the kitchen making tea. He moved slowly now, careful with his trembling hands. "Grandpa," she said, "I found your logbook." He turned and saw what she was holding. His face went very still. "I see. You killed 2,400 people." "Yes." "How do you live with that?" Keller poured the tea into 2 cups. He sat down at the table and gestured for her to join him. "I live with it," he said slowly, by spending every day trying to be better than I was, by raising your mother to value truth over propaganda, by teaching you to question everything even when it comes from your own government, by making sure your generation doesn't make the mistakes mine made. But 2,400 people died because of you. Yes, I believed I was defending my country. I believed the propaganda. I believed the lies. I was wrong. There is no excuse. There is no justification. I can only try to do better with the time I have left. Evelyn looked at the logbook, then at her grandfather, then back at the logbook. I don't know how to feel about this, she said honestly. Neither do I, Keller said. I've had 45 years to think about it, and I still don't know how to feel. The guilt doesn't go away. It just becomes part of who you are. They sat in silence for a while, drinking tea. Finally, Keller said, Would you like to take a trip with me? There's something I want to show you. In August of 1987, Matthias Keller and his granddaughter Evelyn drove north from New York City toward the Canadian border. Keller was 75 years old. His hands shook on the steering wheel until Evelyn gently suggested she should drive. He agreed and moved to the passenger seat. It was a 6-hour drive. They talked about family, about Evelyn's work, about Elke and Robert and their life in Brooklyn, about Liesel and her medical practice. They didn't talk about the logbook, not yet. As they approached Niagara Falls, Keller heard the sound, even through the closed car windows, even over the engine noise, that deep, continuous rumbling that had haunted his dreams for 43 years. They parked at Prospect Point. Keller got out slowly, using a cane, now his knees stiff with arthritis. Evelyn walked beside him as they followed the path around the corner. And there it was, the Horseshoe Falls, exactly the same as it had been in 1944. 2,600 feet wide, 167 feet tall, 750,000 gallons per second. The roar, the mist, the rainbow in the spray, unchanged, eternal, real. Keller walked to the railing and put his hands on it. The metal was colder than he remembered, or maybe his hands were just older. Evelyn stood beside him, staring at the falls. It's incredible, she said. Keller nodded. 43 years ago, I stood at this exact spot. I was a prisoner of war. I weighed 172 pounds, having gained 47 pounds in 7 months of American captivity. I had just eaten a BLT sandwich and drunk a Coca-Cola and eaten a slice of apple pie. My wife and daughters in Hamburg were eating bark soup. He paused. The water kept falling. I stood here and tried to prove this was fake. I looked for the pumps. I looked for the machinery. I did the mathematics in my head. And I realized it was impossible to fake, which meant it was real, which meant my government had lied to me, which meant everything I believed was built on deception. Evelyn listened quietly. That waterfall, Keller continued, destroyed my certainty. It broke through the propaganda and let reality in. Without that experience, I might have gone home still believing the lies. I might have taught those lies to your mother. Instead, I learned to question everything. He turned to look at his granddaughter. Evelyn, why did I really come back to America? She thought about it. Because they treated you well.
Partly, but more than that. This waterfall taught me something your generation desperately needs to learn. He gestured at the falling water. Truth has weight, physical, undeniable weight. You cannot argue with 750,000 gallons per second. You cannot spin it. You cannot explain it away with clever words. I spent 4 years believing lies because everyone around me believed them. I killed 2,400 men for those lies. Then I stood here and reality was too powerful to deny. Your generation has propaganda too delivered through televisions and computers instead of newspapers and radios. But the lesson is the same. Direct experience cuts through lies. See things with your own eyes. Touch them. Taste them. Trust what you can verify yourself. I came back to America because this country showed me kindness when it could have shown me hatred. Private Dalton Wyatt lost his brother Danny to men like me, but he still called me sir.
He still bought me lunch. He still stood beside me when I broke down crying at this railing. Keller's voice was shaking now, but he pushed on. Some truths are too powerful to deny, some lies are too heavy to carry, and some countries are kind enough to show you the difference. That's why I came back, Evelyn, because I wanted you to grow up in a place where truth matters more than propaganda. They stood together at the railing for a long time, grandfather and granddaughter listening to the water fall. In November of 1994, Matthias Keller died at the age of 82. Heart failure, peaceful, surrounded by family. He left behind a will with specific instructions: $50,000 to the United States Naval Heritage Museum in Washington, D.C. The accompanying note said, "In memory of the approximately 2,400 souls lost to my actions during World War II, and in gratitude to the American soldiers who showed me mercy when they could have shown me hatred." His personal effects were divided among his children and grandchildren. The U-boat logbook went to Evelyn, along with all of Annalise's letters from the war years and the 33 years of correspondence with Dalton Wyatt. His final request was that his ashes be scattered at Niagara Falls. In December of 1994, the family gathered at Prospect Point. Elke was 60 years old. Liesel was 57. Evelyn was 35. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And there was Thomas Wyatt Dalton's son, representing his father, who had died in 1991. Evelyn stood at the railing holding the urn, the same railing her grandfather had gripped 50 years before, searching for proof that reality was fake. She opened the urn and tilted it over the edge. The ashes scattered in the wind and fell into the mist. 750,000 gallons per second carried them away into the churning pool below, into the Niagara River, eventually into Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and finally the Atlantic Ocean. The same ocean where Matthias Keller had sent 2,400 men to their deaths. Before they left, Evelyn read aloud from her grandfather's journal. The entry was dated August 1987, written after their visit to the falls. Some monuments are built by human hands to commemorate victories. Others are carved by nature to remind us of truths we tried to forget. Niagara Falls stands as both a testament to reality's power and a memorial to the 537 men who learned some too late that lies cannot survive the weight of 750,000 gallons per second. My name was Matthias Keller. I killed for lies. I ate while my family starved. And an American waterfall saved my soul. If you remember nothing else, remember this: truth has weight. Seek it, touch it, taste it, before the lies drown you. The water kept falling. It had fallen for 12,000 years before Matthias Keller stood at this railing. It would fall for 12,000 years after. Constant, unchanging, real. A reminder that truth is patient. Truth is powerful. And truth eventually will always break through the walls we build from lies.